Good morning. You're looking live at SpaceX's Launch Complex 39A at NASA's Kennedy Space Center in Florida, where a Falcon 9 rocket is an hour and 8 minutes away from launch with 53 more Starlink internet satellites. You're looking live at the Falcon 9 vertical on pad 39A this morning. Weather conditions appear favorable at this time. The latest weather forecast showed a 90% probability of favorable conditions for liftoff today. Launch is scheduled for 12:08 p.m. Eastern Daylight Time, or 16:08 UTC, to begin SpaceX's 24th Falcon 9 launch of the year, and the first of three Falcon 9s scheduled to launch from SpaceX's three active launch pads over the next 36 hours or so. This mission will be the 48th Falcon 9 flight that's primarily dedicated to deploying Starlink satellites into orbit. And as I mentioned, 53 satellites are on board this mission. I'm Stephen Clark from spaceflightnow.com, and I'll be providing commentary and updates throughout the countdown and the Falcon 9's climb into orbit today. If everything goes according to plan, the Falcon 9 will be deploying the 53 Starlink satellites about 15 minutes after launch. SpaceX's launch countdown now inside of 1 hour until liftoff. Again, you're looking at a live view of the Falcon 9 rocket on Launch Complex 39A at the Kennedy Space Center. In about 24 minutes time, the Falcon 9 will begin to be loaded with propellants. Kerosene and liquid oxygen will be loaded into the vehicle beginning at T-minus 35 minutes. This particular rocket will be flying with booster number 1060 in SpaceX's inventory of reusable rockets. This booster will be going for its 13th trip to space today, a record for SpaceX's fleet of reusable boosters, and will target a landing on one of SpaceX's drone ships or recovery platforms downrange in the Atlantic Ocean, east of Charleston, South Carolina, about 400 miles northeast of Cape Canaveral. Over the past few days, SpaceX teams here at the Kennedy Space Center have readied the Falcon 9 for flight. They mated the Falcon 9 booster, which last flew back in April with its brand new upper stage. And then in recent days, inside the hangar at Pad 39A, just south of the pad, mated 53 Starlink internet satellites already encapsulated inside their payload fairing to the upper stage of the Falcon 9, and at that point the Falcon 9 was fully integrated for flight. Yesterday morning, the Falcon 9 emerged from the hangar to roll about a quarter mile up the ramp to Pad 39A. This was after a busy night already at the launch complex, after SpaceX moved a tower segment for the future Starship launch complex to the pad. You can see some cranes moving there, working on that Starship launch pad, located just about 1,000 feet or so east of the Falcon 9 and Falcon Heavy launch mount there on the left side of the screen. On the right of this view, you can see the hangar, the horizontal integration facility for SpaceX's Falcon rocket family. And yesterday morning, as the construction work continued at a very busy pace at Pad 39A, ground teams rolled the Falcon 9 out of the hangar. You can see in this time-lapse view taken yesterday morning, the door opening there, and in a few moments you'll see the Falcon 9 emerge to begin its rollout. The Falcon 9 rolled out on its transporter erector structure, which carries the rocket up the ramp to Pad 39A and then ultimately raises it vertical. This rollout began before 11 a.m. Eastern Time yesterday. And again, the distance from the hangar at the southern perimeter of the pad to the Falcon launch mount itself at the top of the pad is about a quarter mile or so. So you can see the dual use of Pad 39A in full effect here, with the Falcon rocket rolling out for launch, and that occurring simultaneously with ongoing construction work for the future launch complex for the next generation Starship vehicle, which is going to ultimately stand nearly twice the height of the Falcon 9 when it's fully assembled. Once the vehicle was rolled out yesterday, late morning hours, the next step was to lift the Falcon 9 vertical. This occurred around 4:30 p.m. Eastern Time yesterday. You can see the hydraulic lift raising the Falcon 9 from its horizontal position to a vertical orientation at Pad 39A. This usually takes about 20 minutes or so to lift the rocket vertical. Again, this occurred around 4:30 p.m. Eastern Time yesterday, about 20 hours or so before today's launch opportunity. This will be the 50th flight of a SpaceX Falcon 9 or Falcon Heavy rocket from Pad 39A. And overall, it'll be the 144th flight or 144th launch overall from this launch pad, dating back to the very first flight of a Saturn V rocket in the 1960s. This launch complex has hosted Saturn V, Space Shuttle, and Falcon launches in its history. You're looking now live once again at Pad 39A, 54 minutes until today's scheduled launch time. The launch time is scheduled for exactly 12:08 and 50 seconds p.m. Eastern Time. That's 16:08:50 UTC. T-minus 41 minutes and 45 seconds. The next major milestone in the countdown this morning will be the poll of SpaceX's launch team in the Launch Control Center here at Kennedy Space Center for a go or no-go to continue the countdown and proceed into propellant loading. That propellant loading is due to begin in about 6.5 minutes at T-minus 35 minutes. And leading up to that, SpaceX's launch director will poll their team for their readiness. This is an electronic poll, so you won't hear a go or no-go poll on our audio feed today. But we do expect to hear from SpaceX's launch director after the poll is complete to confirm the outcome of that major milestone and to confirm that all stations are go for proceeding with today's countdown and launch. This mission will be carrying 53 Starlink internet satellites to orbit. On the left side of your screen here, you can see a file photo from a previous mission showing a stack of Starlink satellites as they appear inside the payload fairing of the Falcon 9. Again, this is a photo from a previous mission, but the satellites on board today's flight look much like these. They're flat packed onto the upper stage of the Falcon 9 and held down by 4 metallic retention rods, and those rods keep the satellites firmly attached to the rocket during the climb to space. And once in orbit, the retention rods are released, and that allows the Falcon or the Starlink satellites to be released from the Falcon upper stage and to begin their mission providing broadband internet connectivity. Again, there are 53 spacecraft on this particular mission. Each of these Starlink satellites weighs about 300 kilograms at launch, and once in orbit and once free of the Falcon 9, they will deploy solar panels and run through some automated checkouts and eventually activate ion propulsion systems fueled by krypton gas. And these highly efficient ion thrusters will maneuver the satellites from their drop-off orbit, ranging roughly 140 to 200 miles above Earth, to an operational altitude of 335 miles or 540 kilometers. SpaceX builds these satellites on an assembly line at the Starlink Development Center up in Redmond, Washington, near Seattle. Starlink consumers can connect to the Starlink internet network using a ground-based phased array antenna, much like the one you see here. This photo is a publicity photo provided by SpaceX showing what the antenna looks like. Users can set up the antenna on their roof or in an open field with a clear view of the sky to connect to the satellites as they pass overhead. Now back live here to the Kennedy Space Center inside 39 minutes to launch today. The mission today has an instantaneous launch opportunity at 12:08 and 50 seconds p.m. Eastern Time, or 16:08:50 UTC. This is the specific launch opportunity today to launch these satellites into the correct orbital plane to join the rest of the Starlink fleet, which now numbers more than 2,000 active satellites. And with today's launch of 53 more, SpaceX will have launched more than 2,700 Starlink satellites in total, but that tally includes some prototypes and test satellites and older satellites that are no longer in service. Now T-minus 38 minutes and counting, so we'll stand by for word from SpaceX's launch director. We expect to hear that momentarily on the outcome of the pre-launch pre-fueling poll.
This is LB on countdown. Go for prop load.
Tanks venting for prop load.
Now T-minus 36 minutes, 35 seconds. We just heard a few moments ago from SpaceX's launch director that the poll is complete. All stations inside the firing room at the Launch Control Center here at KSC are go for propellant loading. So densified kerosene and liquid oxygen will begin flowing into the Falcon 9 at T-minus 35 minutes.
Launch auto is started.
Now inside of 34 minutes until launch, at the T-minus 35 minute mark, we heard confirmation from SpaceX's launch team that the propellant loading process is underway. This is known as the start of the launch auto sequence. So now computers are running the Falcon 9 countdown. Computers will oversee the loading of propellants over the next half hour or so, and run the Falcon 9 through a series of checks to make sure all parameters remain within limits and everything remains go for liftoff. Launch of this mission, designated Starlink 4-19, is scheduled for 12:08 p.m. Eastern Time, or 16:08 UTC. Now 33 minutes away. Now inside of 33 minutes, here's an overview of the Falcon 9's countdown and what we can expect to hear and see over the next half hour or so. We've passed the first couple of milestones with the go for propellant loading and the start of prop loading at T-minus 35 minutes. Right now, 3 of the 4 propellant tanks on the Falcon 9 rocket are being loaded. Kerosene and liquid oxygen are flowing into the first stage, while kerosene alone is now being pumped into stage 2. At T-minus 16 minutes, liquid oxygen will begin loading into the second stage. This is the cryogenic oxidizer that's consumed by the rocket's Merlin engines in combination with rocket-grade kerosene known as RP1. At about T-minus 7 minutes, the Falcon 9 rocket's Merlin main engines at the bottom of the first stage will begin to be thermally conditioned. This is known as chill down, to condition those engines by flowing some super cold oxidizer through some of the plumbing of that propulsion system. At about 5 minutes before launch, the Falcon 9 should be fully loaded. Both stages should be fully loaded with kerosene at that point. About 46,000 gallons of rocket-grade fuel will be loaded into the vehicle today. At about 4.5 minutes before launch, the strongback structure will be retracted away from the vehicle to a position about 1.5 to 1.8 degrees away from the Falcon 9. And you'll see that visually in our view of the pad. You can see that strongback structure retract slightly at that point in the countdown. And at T-minus 1 minute, the Falcon 9's onboard flight computer will take command of the countdown and oversee the final pre-launch checkouts. And during that final minute of the countdown, the propellant tanks will all be brought to flight pressure, and the vents will be closed to allow those tanks to be pressurized. At T-minus 45 seconds, the SpaceX launch director will verify their final go for launch. And then at T-minus 3 minutes, the ignition system on the Falcon 9's Merlin main engines will be activated to ignite those engines. Those 9 engines at the bottom of the first stage will be brought to full power. And assuming all the engines are working well, hydraulic clamps will release at T0 when the clock hits 0 to allow the Falcon 9 to begin its vertical climb into space from pad 39A. Now T-minus 30 minutes and 23 seconds from launch. T-minus 28 minutes and 33 seconds and counting. The booster flying today is booster number 1060 in SpaceX's fleet. This particular booster is the fleet leader, or will become the fleet leader after today's launch, going for its record 13th flight. 2 other boosters in SpaceX's fleet have reached the 12 flight milestone along with this particular rocket. But this rocket will extend that to 13 missions today. It debuted back on June 30th of 2020 with a GPS satellite launch for the U.S. Space Force. And since then, it's flown a number of missions, as you can see in this chart. Multiple flights with the Starlink internet satellites, as well as the Turkish Turksat 5A geostationary communications satellite, as well as a Transporter 2, a multi-payload small satellite rideshare mission that carried 88 satellites to orbit back on June 30th of last year. And so in about 2 years of service, this particular rocket will be going for its 13th flight today, a record for a reusable Falcon rocket stage. SpaceX intends to recover the rocket to downrange on a drone ship, a shortfall of Gravitas, on station about 400 miles northeast of the Kennedy Space Center, roughly due east of Charleston, South Carolina in the Atlantic Ocean. With the tanking operations now underway at Pad 39A, you can see some vapors streaming away from the Falcon 9 rocket at this point. Over the next 20 minutes or so, when tanking is progressing, you should be able to see the level of frost, a white band on the dark background of the Falcon 9 booster. That white band is actually frost and ice building up from the super cold liquid oxygen being loaded into the rocket. And throughout the countdown, you can see that white band rise in its level on the height of the Falcon 9 stage to basically illustrate or show you the level of propellant inside that tank. The bottom third of the Falcon 9 first stage, at the very bottom of the vehicle in this view, is the kerosene tank, and that is not stored at cryogenic temperature, so there will be no ice or frost building up on that portion of the rocket. But you can see the frost and vapors appearing from the Falcon 9, indicating that the propellant loading is now well underway. It began about 9 minutes ago. Again, both propellant tanks on stage 1 now being loaded, while the kerosene tank on stage 2 is being filled at this point as well. In parallel with these propellant loading operations, helium pressurant is also being loaded into the high pressure spheres or reservoirs on the Falcon 9 rocket. That helium is used to maintain pressure inside the Falcon 9's propellant tanks as that liquid oxygen and kerosene is consumed during the flight. At the very top of the Falcon 9 is the payload fairing with 53 Starlink internet satellites on board. In this view, you can also see the crew access arm folded back up against the tower at pad 39A. That crew access arm is used for astronaut missions on the Falcon 9 rocket with the Dragon spacecraft. But for missions like today's that are just carrying satellites to space, the crew access arm is kept in its retracted position, folded up against the fixed service structure at pad 39A. On the left side of the tower in this view is the water tower that contains water for the sound suppression and acoustic dampening system used to reduce the acoustic noise of liftoff to prevent any damage to the ground facilities near the rocket from the powerful thrust from the Falcon 9's main engines at liftoff. Now 24 minutes and 20 seconds from launch of today's flight. Today's mission is designated Starlink 4-19, and it's the 48th Falcon 9 flight, primarily dedicated to hauling satellites into space for the Starlink internet network. 53 more going to space today to bring the total tally of Starlinks launched to date to more than 2,700 satellites.
Stage 2 fuel load complete.
Now T-minus 20 minutes and 10 seconds. We just heard the call out from SpaceX's launch team that the Stage 2 fuel load is complete. So the rocket-grade kerosene tank on the second stage is now full. Kerosene continues loading into Stage 1. At this time, we're seeing the so-called big vent of oxygen vapor from the strong back of the out of pad 39A. This is a typical appearance at this point in the countdown as SpaceX completes fuel loading on Stage 2 and then begins chill down of the strong back to thermally condition some of the liquid oxygen loading lines on that ground structure, or that structure leading up the Falcon 9 inside the Strongback Tower. And this chill down thermally conditions those lines for the start of liquid oxygen loading at T-minus 16 minutes. Everything continuing to look very good at this time for liftoff of the Starlink 4-19 mission at 12:08 p.m. Eastern Time. For those of you looking for a precise launch time, the launch time is set for exactly 12:08 and 50 seconds p.m. Eastern Daylight Time. That's 16:08:50 UTC. Now less than 19 minutes away from launch. Again, this will be the 50th SpaceX launch from pad 39A and the 24th SpaceX launch of the year overall from the company's 3 operational launch pads here in Florida and in California. Weather conditions continue to look favorable for launch. Just a few clouds overhead, mostly sunny skies as we approach the noon hour here on Florida's Space Coast.
Start of Stage 2 LOX load.
We just heard confirmation from SpaceX's launch team that the liquid oxygen loading on Stage 2 is underway, and that coincided with the end of the vent from the strongback, marking the completion of the chill down of the strongback oxidizer lines and the start of the actual flow of liquid oxygen into Stage 2, 16 minutes from launch from pad 39A here in Florida.
This is LD on countdown. Launch control. Update the T0 to 160920.
Issuing T time of 16:09:20 now.
We just heard a call out from SpaceX's launch director that the exact launch time today has actually been pushed back by 30 seconds. So the new launch time is set for 12:09 and 20 seconds p.m. Eastern Daylight Time, or 16:09:20 UTC. No explanation given for this slight shift in the launch time. This is rather unusual at this point in the countdown for SpaceX to adjust the launch time by just 30 seconds. So we're not sure why that's occurring, but the new launch time, again, 30 seconds later than the original advertised time, now set for liftoff at 12:09 and 20 seconds p.m. Eastern Daylight Time, or 16:09:20 UTC. We've adjusted our clock on the upper right of the screen for this new T0. So liftoff is now 11 minutes and 33 seconds away with these next 53 Starlink internet satellites. T-minus 9 minutes and 7 seconds away from launch of the Starlink 4-17 mission. This particular launch will be heading downrange toward the northeast from Pad 39A here at the Kennedy Space Center. This map shows the approximate trajectory that this rocket will be following. It'll be tracking, again, northeast from Pad 39A out over the Atlantic Ocean. And SpaceX's drone ship, a shortfall of gravitas, roughly the size of a football field, is floating in the Atlantic Ocean about 400 miles downrange from the launch pad, or roughly due east of Charleston, South Carolina. And if everything goes according to plan, the booster stage will be landing on that drone ship about 8.5 minutes after launch. The red line here shows the track of the Falcon 9 downrange. After it leaves the area covered in this map, it'll be flying off the east coast of the United States, east of Cape Cod, and then east of the Canadian Maritime Provinces and over the North Atlantic Ocean before deploying the 53 Starlink satellites about 15 minutes after launch. This shows the timeline of major events today. This timeline is produced from data provided by SpaceX. The Falcon 9 will be exceeding the speed of sound, or Mach 1, about a minute after launch. At T plus a minute and 12 seconds, it'll be passing max Q. This is the period of maximum aerodynamic pressure or stress on the vehicle during the flight. The 9 Merlin engines will be cut off and shut down at T plus 2 minutes and 27 seconds, followed 3 seconds later by stage separation. And then at T plus 2 minutes and 37 seconds, the Merlin vacuum, or MVAC engine, the single engine on the upper stage, will ignite for a burn lasting about 6 minutes to place the 53 Starlink satellites into orbit. That will be quickly followed by jettison of the payload fairing at T plus 2 minutes and 42 seconds. This is a rather early time for payload fairing jettison. SpaceX in recent flights has been experimenting with the jettisoning the fairing earlier than it normally would for other launches to basically increase the performance of the Falcon 9 by shedding that weight a little earlier than usual. So that's occurring at T plus 2 minutes and 42 seconds, about 45 seconds to a minute earlier than it would be jettisoned on a typical commercial satellite launch. All this occurring while the first stage begins its descent back to the drone ship with an entry burn using 3 engines lasting 30 seconds to help slow down for re-entry. And then finally a final landing burn with a center engine on the first stage to settle the rocket onto the deck of the drone ship at T plus 8 minutes and 35 seconds. Moments later, the second stage will be shut down, its engine at T plus 8 minutes and 45 seconds after reaching a preliminary transfer orbit. And that will set the stage for the deployment of these 53 Starlink satellites altogether at T plus 15 minutes and 26 seconds.
Tanks pressing for strong back retrack.
Now, inside of 5 minutes until launch, the kerosene tanks on the Falcon 9 rocket should be fully loaded at this time with about 46,000 gallons of rocket-grade kerosene, also known as Rocket Propellant 1 or RP1. The next major milestone in the countdown will be the retraction of the strongback on the right side of the vehicle in this view. That'll move back about 1.5 degrees away from the Falcon 9, and that should be beginning momentarily. T-minus 3 minutes and 40 seconds. We also heard confirmation a little earlier that the chill down of the Merlin engines began at about T-minus 7 minutes. So that was a major milestone in the countdown. And now you're seeing the strong back retracting. If you look closely in this view, you can see the strong back is swinging away from the Falcon 9, moving to a position just about 1.5 degrees away from vertical. The strong back will be swung back in a more rapid fashion at liftoff to clear the way for the Falcon 9 to begin its climb off the pad. Now 3 minutes from launch of the Falcon 9
Stage 1 lock load complete.
On the Starlink 4-19 mission, we just heard confirmation that the first stage liquid oxygen load is complete. So that's 3 out of 4 tanks fully loaded. In the next few seconds, or the next 30 seconds or so, we should hear confirmation that the second stage has been fully loaded with liquid oxygen propellant. T-minus 2 minutes and counting.
Stage 2 lock load complete.
And there's the call out you may have heard. Stage 2 LOX load is complete. The Falcon 9 is now fully loaded with propellants, about 1 million pounds of liquid propellants, kerosene and liquid oxygen now loaded into the vehicle. You can see a dump of water now from the water tower on the left side of the screen. This often happens late in the countdown, and that water tower will be flowing large amounts of water onto the pad deck at engine start.
Falcon 9 is in startup.
Falcon 9 is now in startup. We've heard confirmation of that. Falcon 9's onboard computer now in control of the countdown, T-minus 45 seconds.
Falcon 9 Starlink LD is go for launch.
T-minus 27 seconds. T-minus 20.
T-minus 15 seconds.
T-minus 10 seconds.
10.
T-minus
9,
5,
8,
4,
7,
3,
6,
2,
5,
1.
4, 3,
Ignition.
2, 1, 0. Ignition.
And liftoff of the Falcon 9 rocket,
And liftoff.
hauling 53 more Starlink internet satellites to orbit, marking the 100th flight
M1D chamber
of a
pressure
Falcon
nominal.
reused booster.
Vehicle is pitching downrange.
Power and telemetry nominal.
Falcon 9 is supersonic. Max Q. MVAC chill.
Now, T plus 100 seconds, just passing a minute 45 seconds now. A good climb out for the Falcon 9 so far from pad 39A as the rocket heads downrange, heading northeast from the Kennedy Space Center. 53 more Starlink satellites on the way to space now. In about 30 seconds, we should see engine cutoff. We should see the first stage's 9 Merlin engines shut down in about 20 seconds now. Standing by for MECO, or main engine cutoff. And there is visual confirmation of main engine cutoff.
MECO.
Stage separation confirmed.
Heard confirmation of stage separation now.
MVAC ignition.
And there's a call out of MVAC ignition.
Fairing separation confirmed.
And call out also of payload fairing separation. So the Falcon 9's upper stage now firing. We've switched our stream over to SpaceX's feed. This comes with a few seconds delay. About 20 seconds or so delay now. So this is what you're seeing happened a few moments ago of stage separation. Onboard camera views showing the staging event. And there's payload fairing Jettison on the right. Again, SpaceX's stream has these spectacular views from onboard cameras, but it does come with about a 20-second delay. On the left side of your screen, you can see the titanium grid fins on the first stage booster extending to begin controlling its descent back to Earth. You see the state of Florida with scattered cloud cover in the background.
Acquisition of signal Bermuda. Both vehicles are following nominal trajectories.
SpaceX reports both the first stage and the upper stage are following the expected trajectory at this time. You're continuing to watch onboard views from cameras on each segment of the rocket. On the left, the first stage, which is coming back to Earth for landing. And on the right, the engine bell glowing red hot on the MVAC engine on stage 2.
Stage 1 FDS has safed.
Stage 1 entry burn startup.
We've heard verbal confirmation from SpaceX Launch Control of the start of the entry burn. We should see that manifest itself in the onboard video on the left side of the screen in a few moments.
Stage 1 entry burn shutdown.
And there's entry burn startup in the video. 3 engines firing to slow the rocket down for its entry deep into the atmosphere. You can see the velocity meter on the lower left
to follow nominal trajectories.
decreasing rapidly during this burn at an altitude of about 40 kilometers. On the right, stage 2 continuing to function well, heading to orbit with 53 satellites.
Stage 1 transonic. Stage 2 is in terminal guidance. Stage 1 landing burn.
Stage 2 FDS has safed.
We've heard the call out from launch control that the landing burn has started. Again, this video is about a 20-second delay, so we should see that landing burn begin on the onboard camera view shortly.
Stage 1 landing leg deploy.
Going through some cloud cover now, you can see that landing burn underway. The shadow of the booster now visible.
Stage 1 landing confirmed.
And we've heard a call out of landing confirmed. So let's watch that happen.
MVAC shutdown. Acquisition of signal Newfoundland. Nominal orbit insertion.
Spectacular video showing booster number 1060 settling onto the deck of the drone ship. A shortfall of gravitas in the Atlantic Ocean, completing its 13th trip to space. This particular booster has now launched 640 satellites on 13 missions. It debuted on its first flight on June 30th of 2020 and is now SpaceX's fleet leader. 13 missions in the books. This was the 100th flight of a reused or previously flown Falcon booster overall. We also heard a call out from SpaceX Launch Control that the upper stage has completed its burn to place these 53 Starlink satellites into the intended orbit. Spacecraft deployment is expected in about 5.5 minutes. SpaceX reports they're going to sign off their webcast and end their live video coverage before the deployment of the Starlink satellites. We'll stand by for confirmation, and we should hear a call out from SpaceX Launch Control to confirm that event when it happens. Now about 4.5 minutes from spacecraft deployment. So we won't be able to bring you any live views from the vehicle, from the rocket during this separation sequence because SpaceX has ended their webcast. But they're still providing this tracking map that we're putting on our stream. And we still have mission audio feed from SpaceX Launch Control. And hopefully we hear confirmation of deployment when it happens.
loss of signal, Bermuda.
As we wait for a confirmation of spacecraft deployment, we invite you to become a Spaceflight Now member. You can go to spaceflightnow.com and go to the Members tab at the top of the homepage. And if you become a member, not only are you supporting our coverage and helping us continue to do what we do to cover all the launches here at Cape Canaveral and around the world, you'll also have exclusive access to a live, continuous video stream of Pad 39A showing the Starship launch pad as it begins to rise from the pad just east of Launch Complex 39A, where the Falcon 9 took off today. The first tower segment for the Starship launch pad tower rolled out to Pad 39A a couple of nights ago, and we expect to see more of those tower segments arriving at the pad in the coming weeks. Eventually that tower will rise 400 feet tall, one of the tallest structures here at the Cape Canaveral Spaceport, and we'll bring that to you live as it happens over the coming weeks. Now about less than a minute away actually now until the expected deployment of the Starlink internet satellites. According to SpaceX's timeline, the separation event should be at T plus 15 minutes and 26 seconds.
Starlink deploy confirmed.
We just heard verbal confirmation from SpaceX Launch Control that the 53 Starlink satellites have deployed. SpaceX releases the satellites by jettisoning 4 metallic retention rods that kept the Starlink satellites firmly mounted on the rocket during the climb to space today. And with those retention rods jettisoned, the Starlink satellites are actually free to release from the rocket and begin their missions. They release all at once and then naturally spread out through differential drag. And then eventually they'll deploy solar panels and activate their krypton-fueled ion engines to complete maneuvers to reach their operational altitude of 335 miles or 540 kilometers at an inclination of 53.2 degrees to the equator. That orbit raising will take a number of weeks to reach the Starlink operational altitude. The target orbit for today was about 150 to 200 miles in altitude, so the Starlink satellites themselves will do about 150 miles or so of orbit raising to reach their operational altitude. It's now been 17 minutes and 19 seconds since the launch of the Starlink 4-19 mission. You're continuing to look live at an empty pad out at Complex 39A. You can see some of the construction cranes visible for the Starship launch tower construction underway at Pad 39A. and the strong back is in its retract position where it moved to at liftoff. With today's mission now in the books, let's take a look at some of the stats for today's launch. This was the 158th launch of a Falcon 9 rocket since the vehicle debuted 12 years ago this month, back in June of 2010. And it's the 166th flight overall of the various members of the Falcon rocket family, the Falcon 1, the Falcon 9, and the Falcon Heavy, since SpaceX's first orbital launch attempt back in 2006. As we've mentioned several times, this set a record for the 13th flight of this particular booster, tail number 1060. And it was the 138th launch of a Falcon 9 from here in Florida, and the 50th SpaceX launch from Pad 39A. 144th flight overall from this historic launch pad, including launches by the Apollo-era Saturn V rocket, the Space Shuttle, and the Falcon 9 and Falcon Heavy family from SpaceX. We saw today the 100th flight of a previously flown or reused Falcon booster. It was the 48th Falcon 9 launch, primarily dedicated to deploying satellites for the Starlink internet network. And this was the 24th SpaceX launch of 2022. And overall, it was the 25th orbital launch attempt from here at Cape Canaveral so far this year. And that tally includes Falcon 9 missions, Atlas V launches, and 2 launch attempts by the small satellite launch company Astra. Looking ahead for what's next on the calendar, coming up just tomorrow in about 21 hours or so, 22 hours or so, is the launch of a Falcon 9 from Vandenberg Space Force Base in California. This mission will take off from Space Launch Complex 4 East at Vandenberg, carrying the Sarah-1 radar observation satellite. This spacecraft weighs about 4 tons. It was built by Airbus and is going to operate for the German military, collecting radar all-weather 24-hour-a-day around-the-clock radar surveillance imagery for the German Ministry of Defense. Next launch here at Cape Canaveral will be on Sunday morning at 12:27 a.m. Eastern Time, or 4:27 UTC, from Space Launch Complex 40 over at the Space Force Station, carrying a spare satellite for Globalstar's commercial messaging and data relay network. This will be the first launch of a Globalstar satellite since 2013, and this will be a spare for their fleet of satellites providing commercial communications coverage from low Earth orbit. And then next week, a couple of launches on tap. First on June 21st, no earlier than June 21st, is the second launch of South Korea's domestically produced homemade Nuri rocket, carrying a test and validation satellite from the South Korean launch base at the Narrow Space Center. This will be the second flight of an all South Korean orbital launcher. And then following that is the launch on June 22nd, next Wednesday, of a European Ariane 5 rocket carrying 2 geostationary communication satellites to orbit, MEASat 3D and GSat 24. And this will be the first launch of an Ariane 5 rocket this year, and it'll launch out of the Guyana Space Center from the Ariane Launch Area number 3 at the spaceport down in Kourou, French Guiana. And amid all of these launches, we'll be continuing to cover the upcoming wet dress rehearsal or countdown rehearsal for NASA's Artemis 1 moon rocket. You can see now a live view of the Space Launch System standing 322 feet tall on Pad 39B. This is just about 1.7 miles or so north of Pad 39A, where the Falcon 9 just took off about 25 minutes ago. And the Artemis 1 moon rocket will be fueled up on Monday with cryogenic liquid hydrogen and liquid oxygen propellants. This is a 4th attempt for a wet dress rehearsal to fully load the rocket with propellants to make sure the rocket and ground systems are all in top shape for the maiden flight of the Artemis 1 rocket, scheduled no earlier than late August. The Artemis 1 mission will be an unpiloted, uncrewed test flight of the Orion spacecraft and its Space Launch System rocket. This Orion mission will be heading to orbit the moon for about 3 weeks to 6 weeks, depending on exactly when it launches. And it'll be essentially a test flight and a shakedown cruise for the entire SLS and Orion architecture before the Artemis 2 mission carries astronauts to the moon on the second flight of the SLS and Orion vehicle. Again, to recap, the Falcon 9 rocket from SpaceX took off from Pad 39A nearly 25 minutes ago. You're looking live once more at Pad 39A, where the Falcon 9 took off with 53 Starlink internet satellites at 12:09 p.m. Eastern Time. Once more, if you want to watch a continuing live stream of Pad 39A, where SpaceX is currently building its Starship launch pad here on Florida's East Coast, you can become a Spaceflight Now member by going to spaceflightnow.com. Go to the Members tab at the top of the homepage, and any contribution you can provide through the Members program supports our coverage, and it gives you a continuing live look of the Starship pad construction at Pad 39A. You can see in this view some of the cranes out at the pad, and as well as the lowermost segment of the Starship launch pad tower, which rolled out to Pad 39A on Wednesday night to begin stacking of that ground launch tower that will be supporting future Starship flights from here in Florida. Once again, thanks for joining us for our live coverage of SpaceX's Starlink 4-19 mission. Another successful flight in the books. That's 24 SpaceX launches so far this year. And we hope you will join us tomorrow for the Falcon 9 launch from Vandenberg Space Force Base. And again, just after midnight, early Sunday morning Eastern Time, for the next Falcon 9 launch from here at Cape Canaveral. Until then, I'm Stephen Clark from spaceflightnow.com. Have a good weekend.